Welcome everyone to the latest CCA broadcast. Our topic for today is fraud, authentication and the customer experience. This is a critical issue affecting organisations across all of the wider CCA network. And of course it affects all sectors, public and private. Today we're going to explore how, by working together, we can make life more difficult for the fraudsters than for the customers. In other words, what can be done at the interface of customer operations in order that there's a greater emphasis on prevention rather than on the very costly reparation in terms of customer losses and obviously damage to brands if we don't tackle prevention seriously. There are some truly alarming stats, and we're going to go into those in a bit more detail later, but just a couple to think about. Fraud's now 40%, it's a staggering number of all crime, and is estimated to cost the UK around £7 billion. It probably could be more than that. I think one of the most alarming stats for me is that 61% of all fraud touches the contact centre in some way, whether it's through harvesting or at a later stage. And just 1 in 500 calls to interactive voice IVR is actually a fraudster, with 40% of IVR attacks are from known fraudsters. So these things point very clearly to a phenomenon that's growing, and we need to really think carefully about how we can, again, as we said earlier, working together to try to do something about this. Now we know that the fraudsters collaborate, they collaborate well. That's part of their success. They collaborate on a whole range of issues. And depressingly, they seem to be one step ahead, which organisations I know find very frustrating. We all find that frustrating. But it then poses the questions to us: do we collaborate enough? And critically, do we do enough to educate customers on the pitfalls and risks? Do we understand how properly thought through technology can assist us and can radically reduce the fraudsters' success? And that's really what we're going to be focusing a lot on today. So with our partners, Smartnumbers, we're going to be exploring all of these issues to understand how we can improve processes in preventing fraud in our organisations. I'm delighted today to welcome our expert contributor, Matthew Addison from Smartnumbers, who are today's event partners. Hi Matthew, how are you?
Hi there, I'm good, thanks. And firstly, thank you very much for having me. I know this is our sort of second meeting in a couple of days, but it's great to be talking with yourselves, the organisation, and also the wider community, because I think you hit the nail on the head there. It is about collaboration, and I look forward to exploring that concept during this conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. Matthew, do you want to just start off by telling us a little bit about yourself, your role, and about Smartnumbers?
Yeah, sure. Probably a good place to start. So my name is Matthew. I think that one's the easy part. I am the Chief Revenue Officer at Smartnumbers. I'm based here in London, actually, and this is one of our media rooms that I'm sitting in. Smartnumbers, who are we? Smartnumbers has been around for 30 years in a number of guises, but has always been on the communication front, and always about making communication secure for organisations. And most recently, I'd probably say in about the last 3, maybe 4 years, our focus has been on how can we help organisations fight fraud, but also improve the customer journey with authentication. And I'm pleased to say that we've had some great success with that, and look forward to exploring that in the next 20 minutes or so.
Okay. Matthew, we've talked about, as you say, some of these things over the last few weeks. We've had a couple of sessions, and I'm sensing there's a real growing interest from everybody in this area. It's kind of a frightening topic. People sometimes find it difficult to confront because they know it's such a critical issue, and at times it can seem actually a bit futile because the successes that we read about and how clever these fraudsters are. And we've talked about these statistics, but if you were to just perhaps talk about your top 3, I mean, it might be your top 2 or your top 4, but top 3 things that organisations really should be doing today to try and have more success, what would those be?
Yeah, I think just before I come on to that, I mean, it's an interesting point you make. Is it becoming more prevalent? I think it's just becoming more known. I think if you went back 5 years, Probably not many people, especially in the contact center world, but even in the general environment, really talked about fraud. It was kind of in the news occasionally, but not majorly so. But those stats you sort of mentioned are sort of mind-boggling and alarming. And if you take 61% of the fraud touching a contact center, the quick maths equation says that's about £4 billion worth of fraud is not enabled, but happens through the contact center in some way or touches it. So what are the top 3 things that we at Smart Numbers are seeing and think that actually we need to adapt? I think one of them, and I always talk about this, and it's not something we do in terms of a general practice, but it's education. I think first and foremost, we as an industry have to educate not only ourselves, but also the end users. And I always sort of have this phrase or this saying that, I go through a security training program in my annual workplace, but I can guarantee that my parents don't do anything like that. And just if they would have a little bit of training just to look out for some key things, perhaps that would help them sort of take their own step to preventing fraud. So I think that's something we can probably spend hours debating, and no doubt we'll cover some of that topic today. So one of them is education. The next one is collaboration. You also mentioned it's quite alarming when you listen to the Met Police and the fraud organisations talk about how much collaboration goes on in the dark web. I won't go into it, but it is quite scary, and it's far more collaboration than I think we or the general working community provide. And I think, we're seeing a huge, one of our big focuses is collaboration and how we enable all the organisations to work together. And again, we'll touch on that, but we're seeing some amazing results in that stage. And then the final thing I'd say, and it's maybe I've grown up with this, but I think one of the things we have to all bear in mind is in the contact center world, we're always challenged with improving the customer journey. And we always have, there's some challenges of cost, time, money, etc., resources. But I do think there is an element of actually we do need to use technology to improve all those and actually use the technology correctly to put multiple barriers up to fight fraud, because unfortunately there isn't one barrier that's going to stop it all. But I think there's a number of steps that can be taken.
Yeah, interesting. And that whole area about the collaboration, I think, is important. And you're right to point out that actually we know so much more about it. It's out in the open now. I think for some time organisations were being accused of hiding it because they didn't want to damage brand. But because so many customers are affected by it, and some of the consequences are horrendous. People losing pensions and life savings. I mean, it's life-changing, awful. And I think so much of that has been picked up. And I know that there's, I think, really now an absolute sort of, it's a real pressure now, isn't it, to get something done about it. One of the benefits of these sessions is that we always encourage organisations to come forward with best practice, because all these sessions feed into the CCA's global standard. Mm-hmm. So today, I know that people will be coming forward on chat and doing things. But one of the other aspects of it is that everybody gets a takeaway, and sometimes it's difficult to remember the conversation. So I know, Matthew, I hope I'm not putting you in the spot, but I know you've prepared some slides here which just go into things just a little bit more detail. Do you want to share some of those with us just now?
Yeah, I would. As I bring them up, I just say, look, obviously I will share the slides here, and we're more than happy to share them for you to send out afterwards. But also, if anybody has any questions throughout, just drop them into chat, and we'll do our best to address them as we come to the end. So if I can work technology, I should do that. That's that. And hopefully everybody can see the first slide, which says tackling contact center fraud. So just to set some context on this, I'm not going to bore you to death with multiple slides, but just a number that we have, and you've already touched on them. 40% of UK crime is fraud. 7 billion is the estimated loss of fraud every year in the UK, which is, when I saw that, and I've worked in this industry for a while, that shocked me. Just shows how much it has become a major focus. And indeed, the government actually announced a number of key programs to try and help tackle this in more detail. And we wait to see the outcome of that. And then also, obviously, you see 61% of fraud touches the contact center at some point. So what are we seeing in the market? Because these are key stats and they can be quite scary, but what are we seeing in our time? And let's just share some of these ideas with you. So we're seeing a number of things. Number one, we're seeing that 1 in 500 calls into the IVR is fraud. That in its own, to me, is kind of is an interesting figure, but is also a figure that says, actually, that's just one call that is the fraud. And what we didn't really know, but we do now know, is actually before that fraud takes place, and that's not always going to happen in the contact center, it may happen offline. An average fraudster actually takes 26 calls makes 26 calls into the IVR to find out the information it needs. And to give you some examples of that and why that happens, I think this is increased because other fraud prevention steps have been introduced. So if we think about something we can all relate to on cards, quite often now, or actually all the time, we have to do two-factor authentication when purchasing something online. And we probably all think, oh, what a pain this is, but actually it's for our own good. But with that taking place, that's pushed fraudsters to act in other areas. And I think that's why you've also seen an increase in fraud or fraud attacks into the contact center. And in those 26 calls, what the fraudsters are doing is they're generally looking and trying to test all the information. Historically, and this is how they used to do it, if you thought you had the credit card details of an individual, you could go into a local shop without CCTV, and you would test to see if you could use that card, and you build up the information, and then eventually you conduct fraud. Now, because most shops have CCTV, which is obviously a digital record of yourself, they need to find other ways, and that's why they're targeting the contact center. And then, we see some other areas that are really quite interesting within the contact center space, and that's that 59% of withheld numbers are generally fraud. If you think how many withheld numbers you probably receive on your own mobile phone in the course of a week, it's quite worrying. But one that I think, and we'll come back to look at in more detail, is that 52% of the fraudsters that we've identified are attacking multiple contact centers. So it's not they're attacking one organization, they're trying their technique on a number of organizations. And actually, we've seen that play out, and we've seen actually how the consortium approach that we'll talk about has started to combat that. What else are we seeing? And these bottom three things here, points here, streamlining the customer journey, managing contact center costs, and protecting customers are nothing new to any of you. But you just have to remember that whilst fraud is increasing and there needs to be steps taken to protect against fraud, you've still got to manage that challenge against making sure your customer journey is good, making sure you hit your KPIs, and the everyday day-to-day challenges that we all know about. So, needless to say, it's not an easy task, and not something that can be undertaken independently. So I guess the question remains then, if this is what we're seeing, how at Smartnumbers are we detecting fraud? And I'm going to break this down into three silos, because I like to talk in threes. It's simple, and hopefully it means that at the end of this, you might be able to take away 3 points. So what do? We're a SaaS-based solution, platform, that uses our 30-year history in core communications, working with organizations like the MOD, governments, and leading FTSE 100 organizations. And what we do now is we actually take the call data that we receive before it reaches the contact center, and we pre-score that data based on a number of signaling activities to ensure that we can actually determine and provide a risk score as that call comes in. So put it into layman's terms, when the call comes through, the agent receives the call, we can already predetermine whether that call is likely to be a fraudster, and let's say it's colored red, or it might be actually we think this isn't a fraudster, it's passed all the authentication sides, and actually it's green, so it can pass through the channel more easily. And in doing that, it's enabled us to actually pick up a large number of fraudsters and fraudulent behavior before it comes in. The second side is us actually mapping the caller behavior. And it's important to remember to think about this. Fraudsters typically, when they're acting, are acting in a certain way. And they'll act in that way until that way is discovered by us or another organization or you, the general public, and then they'll change. So it's all very good having a list of predetermined behaviors that we look for, but actually what we are able to do now with the help of machine learning and AI, is we're able to continuously scan that behavior and identify immediately when one of those parameters changes. So we can start to build a new fraud operating model. And when that model is built out, we can then start to determine actually that what the caller has changed to ensure we can track that new behavior. And I'll give you an example. There was a couple of cases recently where fraudsters actually called into a certain contact center and asked to be asked a certain set of questions because they knew those are the questions that they were supposed to answer. And it got to the stage, if you actually listen to the call, they didn't even wait to be asked. They'd say, would you mind asking me these questions that I know I need to answer? So they give the answers, and actually we track that behavior and we modeled that, and now we can pick out those fraudsters calling through. So these companies have now introduced other steps to try and fight that. But we wouldn't have been able to see that given the volume of data unless you use machine learning and artificial intelligence. And then the third pillar we use, which is the one that I think is really adding the most value, and the one we constantly come back to, is the consortium approach and the effect of collaboration. The consortium is effectively a sharing platform within our application that allows any client to identify fraudsters and then make that fraudster's profile available to other organizations. And actually, what are we seeing when we're doing that? We're seeing a number of things. First and foremost, we're seeing that actually organizations are starting to listen, work together. So if company A has been attacked by a set number of fraudsters and they've identified that operating practice, they're then advising company B to say, not sure if you've seen this, but actually these are the numbers we're seeing calling in, and these are the details. And they're actually running that through their database. And 52% of times they're already identifying that same fraudster calling in, which allows them to then obviously make changes to their processes and to fight that fraud risk. I was quite amazed when I first learned that it was 52% of times that they're actually, we're identifying those fraudsters in other contact centers. Because the more, if you think about it, the more we can add, the higher that number is going to become, because other contact centers may be being attacked by other fraudsters. And when we share that data within the group, yet again, we increase the potential of the solution. And just before I move on, I'll give you two examples of where these actually, this process played out, and the impact it had. Example number one, we're actually running at this present moment a proof of concept. So when we prove the solution, we often go and work with organizations. We take your data and we run it through the solution. And we were doing a live proof of concept, or still are doing the live proof of concept. And in the first week alone, actually, I think it was in day 3, a number of fraudulent numbers were identified within their POV because they were appearing in the consortium and had attacked 2 other clients already. So that, that's hopefully given us a nice tick, and them a nice tick in their business case that they're writing now. The second example I give is actually, and this relates to more of a number, an agent picked up a call that had been flagged by the call signaling and the call behavior as red in their part of the organization. So the agent knew it straight away that this could be a fraudulent activity. And through their training and the online steps, they completed the call, but what they didn't do is actually complete the task. They then circulated back through their fraud team, called the client themselves as part of the process, asked the client to verify that they'd made this request. The client confirmed no, which they knew it would be. And actually that one call prevented 4 million in transfer out of their bank account. So, when you ask us what is the value, I guess, that people are seeing, okay, that's a high ticket item. Not everybody makes a request to transfer 4 million, but actually it just goes to show that without that information coming through and that pre-risk score, that agent may not have known or been wise to the fact that that was likely to be a fraudster, and may have pushed that transaction through, which would have then resulted in, as you pointed out earlier, the whole retro side of which is the reclaim, the cost, the challenge it brings to your brand reputation, etc., let alone the challenge and hurt it brings to the individual. So 3 quite powerful things: call signaling, call behavior, and the consortium side, how we tackle the fraud in detecting the fraud at Smart Numbers. Anything you would like to add at this point, or comment you want to make?
Yeah, I'm staggered by that, the point you made there about the agent call and the volume, and obviously everything's 4 million, but I guess there must be lots and lots of calls for tens of thousands and 50s of thousands and everything, which would again for many customers is life-saving. In the absence of this technology, what would organizations do if they didn't have technology? What would they be expecting agents to be picking up behaviors, or how would it work?
It's a combination. I mean, we speak to companies and we see a number of things. I mean, first of all, we all go through the KBA, asking you those simple questions: what's your mother's maiden name, place of birth, etc. And these are standard processes that have been in place for a long time. But I'm afraid to say, and this is probably where the educational part comes in, actually it's quite easy to break that information, because we're so desperate as individuals to tell everybody what we're doing all the time that you only have to go onto a social media account and you can probably work out my date of birth, my mother's maiden name, and my pet's name, which gives you a lot of information to then actually hack into or phish into accounts. So I think the first thing is there are steps in place, but it's probably outdated. The second side is it then comes down to the agent, and I think that's a horrible thing for the agent personally. I mean, an agent's job is stressful enough. They have KPIs to meet, we all know that, and they have probably quite a lot of time dealing with irate customers, because that's typically why you call into the IVR in the digital world. And ultimately they're under a lot of pressure, so they're trying to please, and I don't know if I could sit there on a phone and actually pick out by answering a number of questions whether somebody was a fraudster or not.
Interesting. Yeah, the mother's maiden name's interesting. I was just asked that actually very recently, and it struck me just how ridiculous. I told the company concerned, absolutely ridiculous. You know, to be using that if that was the main test, incredible.
And the other side to it actually is you can go too far. Because actually, I think there's, it's well known in the industry that over the last 5 years, it takes now 50% longer to authenticate when you call into an IVR. And typically, as you and I discussed, you're asked lots of questions that you can't remember, or you don't understand the terminology behind it. So if it's a PIN, or is it a code, or is it something else, and what's your fifth letter of your memorable word? A lot of the time we don't know this anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. All had experience of that, I'm sure.
Yes, I'm sure we all have. And probably because at the time you were trying to think of a very clever password in the first place, and then look for inspiration around the room. So that's what we're seeing. So what I want now just sort of to bring that back home is to see what are the outcomes of what we're doing, and how, the detection of the fraud is one thing, but what does that mean in real life? And I've only got a couple more slides, so bear with me a second. The typical outcomes are, I guess I've summarized in 5 points here. First and foremost, we aim to be sort of the front door in stopping fraud. Will there always be other ways to stop fraud? Yes, there'll always be lots of technology. But actually, when it comes to the fraud that is touching the IVR and the contact center, because of our knowledge of the call routing and the callers, etc., then our aim and our role here is to stop that fraud and be that front door. Once that information is understood, you then, as an individual or an organization, have a number of things you can do. And we probably see 2 to 3 things pay out. We see organizations that basically let the agent progress with the call if it's a fraudster, and actually that they flag it and they know that it could be fraudulent, and therefore it's automatically sent to the fraud team to then further investigate. And typically organizations are doing that because they want the crime to happen so that they can then prove this crime, and then they can work with the law enforcement agencies to hopefully try and capture them. The second side is actually the call is passed straight to a fraud team who are specialists in dealing with that, and they then take over the ownership. And then other organizations do other things, but effectively, that risk score is provided, and you can do what you want with that and build it into your own customer journey. In terms of a return, we typically see about 4 times return. We just touched on the 4 million prevented, and offline I'm more than happy to go into a number of key stats. But I think the key thing here is that actually we not only try to prevent it, which is one thing, so there's a return on the prevention, which is going to be huge. We also look to improve the customer journey side, because ultimately we all know the stat that if it takes 25 years to build a reputation, it takes 1 day to ruin it. So if somebody has a negative experience, that concept and connotation plays out through them removing their business. And then the other sort of returns you see are obviously the improved customer journey, but also the way that actually your general things like KPIs are met, and your cost to serve decreases. Point number 3 I just touched on here is the consortium network effect. I can't overemphasize this, and this is something since I've been here that I've just been blown away with. The willingness of the individual organizations to share that data so that they can actually be more effective. Is something I think will only increase. We actually have a consortium event coming up, and we have a number of organizations that are asking to come and partake and want to be able to access that data. But obviously we have to protect that data, but people are willing and are starting to show willingness to work together. And then the final outcome, and I touched on this a little bit, and it's probably the last slide I get to, is it really helps improve the customer experience. And it does that for a number of reasons. One, yes, it prevents fraud, which is key. We want to prevent the fraud, therefore we protect our own individual savings, details, etc. But the other side is it actually improves the customer journey through authentication. And if we just play this through, I said earlier there's been a 50% increase in the time it takes to authenticate. And look, I work in this industry, but it frustrates me every time I do something that I've got to remember all the details, and it takes me a long time. And all I want to do is just tell whoever I'm calling why I'm calling. Therefore means I'm not very satisfied and I'm getting frustrated. But actually, by taking the opposite effect of the process, i.e. if I call in, I am who I am, because if 1 in 500 calls is a fraudster, that means 499 calls aren't fraudulent. So how do you improve the journey for those 499? We use auto authentication, and actually by auto authenticating myself on the call with before it comes in, my customer experience increases, because my call handling time that I'm on the call for reduces by 20 to 30 seconds on average, which for me improves the journey, but also for you, the contact center providers, means that you can obviously reduce your overall costs. So there's two sides, I guess, we see to it. It's the fraud side and the authentication side. And ultimately, you know, that's why we're here, and we're having a large number of success, and we're seeing a lot of organizations running proof of concepts and using the solution as we speak. Anything else from you, Anne-Marie, there?
No, thanks for that. There's a lot, I think, a lot of very, very useful data there. And you're right, there's a balancing act, isn't there? We get frustrated when we get asked all these questions, but equally we would be more frustrated if something happened. But if we could improve the customer journey, then all the better. So I'm just struck by just one sort of question I thought about was, obviously what you're talking about. I mean, does it kind of does it change in the contact center infrastructure? We know that any changes to large customer operations is, you know, is difficult and challenging. How long before organizations would see the value, and how easy is it to implement something like this, a change like this?
So look, on one hand, I'm going to sit here and tell you it's relatively straightforward, and I'll give you an example as to why. But I'll also say that, you know, you do have to go through your processes, and if you are diverting incoming numbers, there's a process to go through, and there's an internal due diligence process to go through, and that's the part I can never quite quantify because I don't know each individual organization. But typically we have a number of ways of connecting to the networks. We connect as the call comes in, and that call, because we are an Ofcom regulated call carrier, is relatively straightforward for us to migrate into our process. The call goes through a screening process, and then that information is then fed back into via our SaaS solution into the contact center's own screen. To put it into context to how long can it take, we connected into a recent POV in a week, and then actually within 3 days we were seeing results because, you know, the data starts flowing through. Now, a full deployment will take a bit longer because ultimately, you know, we probably look at about 3 months for a typical POV, in which time we do see value, and then most POVs just continue into running because once it's there and they can see the data, it actually means they continue to work with it. And the reason it's relatively straightforward is because actually we're not really that intrusive in the terms of the technology. It's just a redirecting of the number to go through our own solution, then back into the contact center infrastructure, which these days with cloud APIs is relatively straightforward.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, it sounds like, as you say, it's the direction of travel has got to be much more collaboration. People are really interested, I think, in finding out how other organizations do things, and critically, how can they basically jump on that train, if you like, where there's so much knowledge about the as you call it, the common fraudsters. I mean, the stat 52% are attacking lots of different centres. So it's incredibly, I think, alarming on one hand, and then on the other hand, you think, well, actually, there's a benefit. You know, if ever there was a benefit to collaboration, this must be it. Matthew, I think we've kind of run out of time here. I just really want to say that, again, if people have got questions and so forth, please, the chat's ongoing. We'll do our best to answer as much as we can just now and after. I know that Matthew's on hand to answer questions individually and collectively. We're going to be doing a few of these sessions. I see this as the beginning of a collaborative journey with CCA membership. We collaborate on just about everything. We've done lots of collaboration around this whole area of security. We are at a point where we're really hungrily looking for lots of good practice to add and augment to the CCA Global Standard guidelines. Always looking for good stories, and for people who've won in particular areas and who've got something that they want to share, which can be a benefit to other organisations. So we're always looking for ideas and good practices, and, as I say, wins that people have in this really, really tough thing. It's never going to be a once and done. This is going to be an ongoing journey. It's definitely, again, I think something we talked about earlier was the whole piece about fraud journeys. You know, we look at our own customer journey mapping. We do it all the time. Do we do the fraudster journey mapping? What's your thoughts on that, Matthew? Do we understand enough about it, do you think, as organisations? Are we getting better at it?
Do we understand it enough as organisations? The fact that there's 7 billion in fraud that goes on in the UK economy says we have work to do. I guess is the honest answer. But are we getting better at it? Yes. That is probably, well, that's not probably, that is why, when we're seeing the fraud taking place, and we're now mapping that journey with the help of the AI and machine learning, and actually talking with the consortium individuals, we're now building up a whole bank of profiles of operating processes that the fraudsters are using, which means that within the consortium database is not only the identification of the numbers or where the call is coming from, for an example, it's also what are they doing, what's the behavior they're doing. And then if we find that in one, if they share it with the others, they actually then validate this back. And we had a great story the other day where one of our organizations could identify that the calls coming in were fraudulent and where they were from. And then the transaction took place to another organization that isn't in the consortium, but they were friendly with them. But that organization knew who the individual was and had a photo of them. So actually, they've brought that information together as part of their investigation. And now that is being shared and is being taken to the Met Police. So yeah, the information is there and it's bringing it together. And that's part of the session we actually have on the 4th of July, not Independence Day, Fraud Fighting Day, or Fraud Consortium Day, as I like to call it. And we're having a whole morning with our users, going through and talking about what do we know, how can we improve it, how can we map it, etc., and how can we be more collaborative, because there's lots of things to still do.
Okay, great. Well, on that note, I'm going to call an end to the session. I'd like to thank everybody who's tuned in today and who's taken part, and for all your questions and chat. We hope we've given you something to think about and to take away, and most importantly, something to act on and to comment on. And let's all work together to make sure that we can, as we said earlier, make the lives of the fraudsters more difficult, not the lives of the customers. So thank you for taking part, and goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.